Greetings and welcome. We are this evening in our 1010 class, meeting number 6. This is the June 6th session, and I'm recording because I know one or two of us are not here this evening. I want to begin right away by reviewing the meeting's number 6 cover sheet. I'm going to do things a little bit differently this evening just by virtue of absences and the like. I'm going to give my lecture, and then we'll watch the 8-9 lectures of the teaching company back to back. That will allow for us to get out of the project as soon as we're finished with those 2 lectures. I've got 1 lecture to give this evening in preparation for the paper that's coming. So steel yourself, prepare yourself for lots of talking heads tonight. I'll do my best, and hopefully you can listen to technology. So let's begin first of all by pointing out the meeting number 6 cover sheet of 2 packets this evening. Packet number 1 is your chapter 5 annotations, your grammar handbook of section P. The teaching company lectures will flow tonight, 8-9. Also your chapter 5 paper opposing positions this evening comes due. Okay. Then we've got your second packet, and that is your final paper number 1. That will be your either chapter 2 or chapter 3 paper. And again, these are 2 separate packets. And again, you want to make sure you have cover sheets for both. All right? Questions, comments, observations? Good evening, Mr. Overcast. We're just finished, Mr. Overcast, with summary of work for this evening, coming due the 2 cover sheets and the like. We will now move on. Let's talk now briefly about the review of meeting number 7, and you may want to open your Axelrod Cooper to page number 297. Okay, 297. And maybe have out some paper for notes, and we can take down a few notes here as we go. The meeting number 7, June 1-1, next Tuesday evening, will involve Chapter 6 annotations with your paragraph annotations as per normal. Chapter 19 annotations in regards to argument and argumentation. Your grammar handbook sections ML, M\L. We will enjoy, if not endure, 4 lectures next week on Tuesday evening. The lectures 10, 11, 12, and 13. So we'll have 2 that we will watch back to back, and then a second 2 at the end. So you want to do special workouts to prepare for that one. Miss Hep likes long, hard workouts, and so that's where we will begin, you see. All right? Then the chapter 6 paper. Now on this one you want to go to 297 if your book's not already open. And let's pay attention now to this one. Now, you're choosing, by the way, you can call this paper for your cover sheet, arguing a position, or the argument paper, okay? And I'll have something to say about persuasion and the like this evening. I'm not going to give much of a lecture on Tuesday evening simply because you will have had your fill of some, 4 lectures is 2 hours of lecturing. So, I'll not take much of your time next Tuesday. Please note you're choosing a controversial issue. You're going to learn more about the issue. You're going to take a position. Now that's the key, and that's what you want to write down. If this evening's paper is presenting opposing positions, they are diametrically opposed. However, you're not choosing a side. The only difference is now you will choose a side. So from the very beginning, you will present your paper with a clearly stated or I'm gonna use a laden term here, arguable thesis. Arguable thesis. In other words, you're going to choose a thesis that requires some understanding of argumentation. It Gets Dark at Night is not an arguable thesis unless you're on some pretty intense LSD. Do you understand what I just said? So you want to choose a thesis that has an antithesis. Do you understand what I just meant when I said that? In other words, there is a clearly diametrically opposed opposite to the position that you're holding. Okay? But you got to choose one of the two sides. Okay? With that in mind, you also want to consider that this paper will require 5 pieces of external validation, and I want you for the first time to begin to pay attention to the MLA style book. That is to say, I want you to be able to look at the packet that I gave to you last time, and I want you to have some sense of, some citation, both in terms of MLA style book in text and end text citation. So for the very first time, I want you to begin to pay closer attention to that component in terms of presentation of validation, or what we sometimes refer to as citation style book. Now, we will hold off in terms of being real critical in our observations about that for at least another round of papers. I want you to begin the process of doing your own research within Axelrod Cooper. Suggestion: take a look closely at the paper that I gave to you as part of that packet of last week. You can do yourself a tremendous favor by just simply reading that paper several times through, making notes to yourself about what makes that paper a paper that follows the MLA style book. All right? Now, of course, we will have some pretty intense reading within the MLA style book and even the APA style book from Axelrod Cooper. You can begin the process of looking ahead. I highly recommend that you do so. So in other words, put a note to yourself maybe to not only be looking at the readings for next Tuesday, namely chapters 6 and 19, but also maybe paying attention to the assigned readings of Thursday of next week, and maybe getting started early on those readings will help you with the paper of Tuesday. All right? With that in mind now, I want to turn to make an observation or two with you about persuasion. So you may want to be working now with some notes and the idea of the arguable thesis. First of all, I want to remind you, as we begin now this evening, I want to remind you about our need to follow the skeleton guide. So that's the first thing I want to say. Let's be sure that you understand especially the key, the pivotal role that your intro paragraph will play. You want to set up your essay always with some kind of what we will call decent hook line. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that skeleton guide, I recommend that you go to page, what is it of the packet? Of the packet that I gave to you last time? Page what is skeleton guide? Is it 8? Did I say that right? Yep. It is, page 8. So you might want to be looking at page 8 of that skeleton guide now as we work through this intel. And if you have any questions for me that are specific, then you can always ask them as we go. That hook line will then lead you to some kind of use of any kind of definitions that are necessary to your paper. Depending upon what your arguable thesis will be, it might very well be the case that you need to define some words. If you're going to define words, you will do that in this intro paragraph, okay? So let's say, for example, that you are going to argue in favor of some kind of legal jurisprudence concept that needs defining. So, for example, if you're going to argue on the notion of immigration as being either pro or against, then you may want to define the very word immigration as you will be using it in the paper itself. Okay? After appropriating definitions, you then are prepared to set up your arguable thesis. Now, the way you will do that is to make sure that you present both sides of the arguable thesis and antithesis. So in other words, if you're arguing for gun control, then you definitely want to present the whole argument in just a line or two. Maybe with a line that would sound something like, the notion of controlling firearms in America or not controlling firearms in America is a heated debate. While there are clearly good observations on both sides of that debate, gun control is necessary in a safe environment in the 21st century in America, blah, blah, blah. That gun control in America would sound and read very much like an arguable thesis. Okay? So in other words, your thesis being traditionally the last sentence of your intro, either paragraphs or paragraph, depending on what it is you're doing, how much you want to do to set up your topic. You then are going to have your actual thesis, and there it must be clear what it is that you are arguing either for or against. Put a note to yourself, our 2 titles project now for the first time becomes paramount, very important. And while some writers of composition or some instructors of composition will not teach a 2-title approach, I recommend in favor of it until you find a prof that tells you to not do it. And if the prof tells you to not do it, then I usually recommend that you just jettison or get rid of the creative title and just stick with the academic title. An analysis of, a discussion of, a critique of, an argumentative paper regarding, and then you'll fill in what it is you're arguing. So for example, blow you away might be the topic, the creative title, and then an academic title, an analysis of how important gun control is in America. Okay? So that is going to set up the reader to know specifically what it is you're working with. Heck.
Why don't you use a treatment of?
That is interchangeable with analysis. In other words, a treatment of, an analysis of, a discussion of. These are all synonymous phrases to set up your arguable thesis and your formal writing. Okay. Sometimes you will find that the paper itself, the type of paper itself, lends more naturally to one of those. So for example, a treatment of almost always works rather nicely for exposition papers, where all you're doing is just presenting the information. An analysis of or a critique of works much nicer in terms of persuasion and argument. Since I've used the term now, let's talk about persuasion for a bit. All right. What is the difference between persuasion and exposition? That's a fair question and one we now want to ask. What is it that we're doing when we're writing to persuade as opposed to maybe writing to editorialize? So let's get these phrases, terms, this nomenclature now out of the way so you can feel comfortable with the idea. The first thing I want to point out is the difference between exposition, editorial writing, opinion writing, and persuasion. First of all, it's fairly self-evident from earlier lectures that exposition of or related to an unbiased presentation of validation. You are presenting information in your paper without any kind of formal bias or opinion. That's exposition. And the expository then writing is very, very important in certain venues within the academic academy, especially in the sciences. When you are doing a lab, for example, you are doing a form of applied exposition. And often in lab writing, and summarizing, you are to stay entirely away from any kind of biased observations. You are simply reporting the information. Years ago, we used to call this dragnet writing because of that TV show called Dragnet, which then became a really bad Dan Aykroyd movie, where the policeman will always just say, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts." He would gain information, and they were always wanting to give him their opinion about what happened, and he would hold them up and say, "I just want the facts." That's kind of exposition writing. We should point out that when you take your 1020 class, and you are obliged to write exposition in a literature course, 1020 literature course, The kind of writing here particularly is what we call a précis, from the French word that we will gain precise, a brief summary of a text, where all you do is simply tell the summary of the events from Arthur Miller's play Crucible, for example, without any kind of opinion about whether or not the play, for example, is a legitimate offering as a response to McCarthy era, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Then what's the difference between expository writing and editorial writing, or opinion writing? And then one step beyond that, persuasion. Well, let's just say it this way. Editorial writing and opinion writing and persuasion writing all is something different from exposition in that it is biased. It is intentionally biased. There is an opinion, there is a position, there is a thesis with a potential antithesis or opposite. But the difference between opinion writing and editorial writing and persuasion writing is monumental. We want to make sure you understand the difference between the two. Editorial writing is what you read in the newspaper when someone stands on the proverbial soapbox and talks about how bad a situation is. Well, say, for example, any number of political positions often are taken. There is no consideration of the other side. Editorial writing is when we simply present our opinion, and we are really more than anything writing to those and for those who agree with us. Okay? Anything you read, I say anything, most anything you read on the editorial page of a newspaper will be someone going off about a position, political or otherwise, that he or she is concerned about, without any consideration of an alternate opinion. An editorial, I'll say it this way, and this makes sense to a lot of students, an editorial on abortion, anti-abortion, doesn't take into consideration at all the legitimacy of the abortion pro-choice stance. Do you got me? Do you understand what I just said? So there's no consideration of the pro-abortion, pro-choice stance in an editorial on abortion from an anti-perspective. Okay? None. In other words, the position is almost taken as anybody that would actually believe in a pro-choice position is clearly an idiot and a fool. And the tenor of the language of editorializing is almost always in this vein. In other words, I have an opinion, it's the right opinion, and everybody else idiots if they don't believe and agree with my opinion. That's editorial writing, that's opinion writing. How is that different from persuasion, argumentation, the work that you will be doing for next Tuesday? And dare I say it, much of the work you'll be doing for much of your time within the academy. When you're writing within the academic community, you are often writing argumentation and persuasion, but you need to understand the difference between this and simple editorializing. Let's go ahead now and define persuasion as the presentation of a thesis that has an arguable thesis that has a clearly distinctive opposite antithesis. But within the presentation of validation, there is a deep concern for both sides of the issue. So that is to say, to quote a popular television show that calls itself news, it is fair and balanced, you see. Okay, right. So there is this attempt to be fair and balanced in persuasive writing that is virtually non-existent when we are working with editorializing. Okay? Now let's define persuasion in more detail. Think of it this way. If I'm having a conversation with Miss Hepp, this could never happen, but we'll say it nonetheless. And I say something to Miss Hepp that just really torques her off. Again, impossible to do. We cannot upset Miss Hepp, I know. But she gets so upset that she looks at Mr. McGee and says, "You are a complete and total jerk." I can't believe you just said that. She gets up and walks out of the room. And I immediately realize that whatever it is that I just said to Ms. Hepp really offended her, and that I need to make sure to make amends. So I do. I follow her down the hall and I say, Ms. Hepp, and she says, no, I am not speaking to you ever again in my life or any other life. You are a total jerk. And I say, Ms. Hepp, I think you believe that I said X. And she says, you did say X. And I say, no, I didn't. You thought I said X, but what I really said was Y. Can I explain? And she says, you didn't say X? And I say, no, I said Y. You thought I was saying X, and now we can begin to have a conversation, dare I say it, a dialogue. I can do that with Ms. Hepp face to face. But if I write something that Ms. Hepp reads of mine, and I offend her, and she stops reading, and she sets the paper down, until somebody can invent paper that actually can speak, hey, pick me up. Keep reading some more and you will understand that I didn't say X, I said Y. Until that kind of paper gets invented, the point I'm making is crucial for persuasion. The minute the reader stops reading, you are no longer writing persuasion. I'll say it again. The minute the reader stops reading, you are no longer writing persuasion. So we have a monumental, compositional project on our hands. That project is easily defined as the following. The writer must write well enough to keep the reader reading. Now, how do we do that? Well, there's two key elements every argumentative, persuasive paper will always have. I'm being, to some degree, a bit redundant with the reading that you will have of your own chapter for preparations of this paper as we get ready for Tuesday. But I'll say it nonetheless. 2. 1. The first consideration that all writers of good persuasion must have is what we will call a consideration of the historical precedent. Now, what does that mean? A consideration of the historical precedent. History of or related to the past, present, or future. Always the past, right? Historical. Of or related to the past, right? What does it mean, precedent? If, for example, I'm a lawyer in a court of law, I'm arguing a case, the judge asks, is there a precedent in this case? What does that mean? Does anyone know what that means? Is there a precedent? There is an argument from the past, some ruling that has already been legitimated, right? That allows for us to be able to look at that ruling and then to apply the findings of that ruling to the present situation. Consideration of the historical precedent is, in a word, research. Research. Okay? In other words, we're always considering what other people have said on any, underline the word, given topic. When I am lecturing a group of university students, I can usually, if the group is mixed, I can usually tell my freshmen from my senior university students pretty quickly by asking a question like the following. What is the best form of government? My freshmen will always step right into it right away. The best form of government is a democracy because I live in a democracy and that is the best form of government and all other ones. That's a freshman. A senior, I can tell right away when I ask the question. Because a senior will usually kind of look back, do one of these, and say that's a really intriguing question. First of all, what do you mean by form when you talk about government? What do you mean by government? What do you mean by best? Because we can begin any place you want to begin. We can start, for example, with antiquity and the classical rendering of Platonic views from the Republic. And of course, we can begin there to begin to talk a little bit about Plato's views. We probably need to consider Aristotle's argument against much of what Plato has to say in Republic when Aristotle voices his opinion in his classic text, Politics. We could talk about Machiavelli's The Prince and his view on might makes right and the application of the Thrasymachon position. All of this is proof to me that that student who is speaking has some understanding that there are multiple perspectives on any question. Multiple perspectives. Those perspectives are rich and varying, and worthy of an important word for us, respect. This is the difference from editorial writing as opposed to writing argumentative persuasion. If I hold a position that I know to be absolutely true, I don't have time for the foolishness on the other side. Their opinions don't matter to me when I write for the Daily Why, you see. I have an opinion, I share my opinion. Anyone who doesn't agree with me is clearly an idiot and a fool. Persuasion is not this at all. Why? Because I got to keep the reader reading. And the only way I'm going to do that, keep the reader reading, is I've got to appear to be fair. And the only way I'm going to be able to do that is to show the reader I've done my research. So about any given topic that I will be working on, are you ready for this? Even in areas where I am considered the expert. Go back to my lecture on the academic community, and I was postulating that one of us, now I can't recall who, is a professor of biology at Stanford in the medical center, where he or she, I can't remember who, I said in our lecture here, discovers the cure for cancer. And I said, remember, that once the discovery is found for a certain strain of cancer, this scientist, this biologist, doesn't go on Oprah, doesn't go on CNN headline news to explain what has been found. Because nobody in the world is going to understand. A very small strata of people use the language of that research. What does this prof do? Writes an essay, right? In that essay, this prof, who is considered the expert in his or her field, in that essay, the very first thing that prof will do is begin to consider the historical precedent. She will begin to cite other studies by other experts. Even though she is the gun in the field, she still will cite and quote others. What I'm now saying is a fundamental principle of the academic community. Anytime we're writing, we're always thinking about what other people have said. Are you ready for this? Both for our position and against our position. That is crucial. We will be researching not only what we agree with and therefore supports our position, but when we're writing good persuasion, we're always researching the other side with, not, as much as we can, unbiased eye. In other words, we're not necessarily just looking to it to gun it down initially. Some of us will begin by writing on position X, only to discover after research we're really in position Y. This happened as recently as a year ago when one of my students was writing a paper in which she was 100% against all forms of immigration into the United States now. And she began her research. She was thoroughly convinced from an editorial position of her position, but she was writing persuasion and therefore she had to do research of the other side. When she began to do research of the other side and the statistics involved, she changed her mind. She actually said it in the beginning of her paper. I had to change my mind on this topic, and I'm now writing actually in favor of immigration. A study of the history of this country proves that if you don't have immigration, you don't have this country. And then she moved on. So a consideration of the historical precedent, 1. 2. The second thing we are always doing when we're writing persuasion is what we call consideration of the acrimonious audience, and by extension, the concession of a point. Okay? Now let's talk about that for a moment. Consideration of the acrimonious audience. Now that's an interesting adjective. Acrimony. Of or related to bitter or sweet? What would you guess? Acrid? Close to acid? It's going to be bitter, isn't it? When I say consideration of the acrimonious audience, then, what do I mean? You must consider an audience that agrees with you or does not agree with your position. Does not agree with you. That's crucial. So you've got to begin from assuming that your reader will not agree with your position. That's different from editorial writing. Editorial writing, if I believe that a certain position is correct, I really could care less that you believe otherwise. You're clearly a fool and an idiot, or you would agree with me. That's editorial writing. But persuasion is something far different. I will actually begin with an assumption that the reader of my paper does not agree with my position at all. And to that degree, I will do a very important rhetorical step called conceding a point. conceding a point. Now, we are blessed in our community with very competitive ball clubs. It would never be said, I don't believe it would be said, of any Worland ball club that in the middle of the game, the team was getting beat so bad that it just conceded the game. What does that mean? To concede you just totally give up. You acquiesce. You completely give up. You say, you know what? We're getting the ever-living snot kicked out of us. Bag it. We'll just throw the game. That's called conceding. So what does it mean to say about the acrimonious audience that we concede a point? What does that mean? Anyone want to take a stab at what that might mean?
Give them
Outstanding, Mr. Overcast. You are going to say something with which the opposite of your position, audience member, will agree with. You're going to say something the other side will agree with. Why would you do that, rhetorically speaking?
so you can counter it in person.
Beautiful! So that you can counter, you can follow up. Of course, if you say something the other side agrees with, the perception will be what in regards to you? Think of it this way. Oh my, has this ever happened in the halls of a high school? We're sitting one. Where the girl walks up to the guy, they've been dating for a long time, and she in fact says to him, "We've been dating for a long time, haven't we? And we're really good friends, aren't we?" Of course, guys are too stupid to know what's coming next, so they just turn and run away. Most guys will respond, "Yeah," without realizing the large aluminum bat is soon to land with the following, and we always follow up conceding a point with a conjunction, but, or however. "We've been friends for a long time, right? Yeah, but I think it's time maybe we start seeing other people." Wham! Conceding a point, saying something the other side will agree with, so you can follow it up with the word "but," the counterpoint. Brilliantly stated by young Overcast, the counterpoint. In other words, let me say something you agree with, so you will keep reading, so I can then follow that up with something you won't necessarily agree with. Let me give you a classic example of this, and no, I will not do this to this group, although I thought long and hard about it. I used to do this, and my 10-10 classes hated my guts for it. I said to them, at the end of a lecture like this, "Your rhetorical mission now is to write on the following thesis: war is good." But wait, I'm not finished, I would say to my group. "I will tell you what the audience is that you're writing for. The audience is a group of peace activists who have chained themselves to the chain link fence down in Utah of a nuclear test site, where they are then chained to that, trying in protest to keep the United States government from testing any more nuclear weapons. They are anti-war activists." That is your audience, and your rhetorical mission is to keep them reading to the very end of your paper. The thesis again is, war is good. And then I would sit back and watch them as they twisted in the wind, trying to come up with ways to rhetorically approach a paper, clearly an acrimonious audience is in waiting, trying to figure out how specifically they would approach that. The easiest solution, of course, is to play with wording, isn't it? That's a rhetorical gimmick that, of course, our speaker here is always talking about as well, isn't he? For example, what if we began our essay by saying, "War is horrible. Children die. Economies suffer. Whole nations brought to their knees often because of the tragedies of war. However, war sometimes is necessary." Now notice what I've done. I have accomplished my rhetorical mission of war is good. But I've done it in such a way, I've framed it in such a way, that even the most acrimonious of audience members to my position, war is good, will have to agree with the opening line, right? War is terrible. Then they will be led to the thesis, sometimes, however, war might be necessary. Let's consider some times in history when maybe war was necessary, even though it was horrible. And then easily in your mind, if you're any student of history, you immediately can begin to think about moments in the history of humankind where conflict, war, was necessary to silence a terrible tyrant. We think, of course, of the Second World War and taking care of a guy like Hitler, and so on, and so on. When we then write, we want to make sure that we pay close attention to the ways in which we are conceding a point. Probably the classic example of this, and you can read it online for yourself and study it again, is the classic Jeffersonian approach in the Great Declaration of Independence. He will say there several times that he really isn't excited to do what it is that he's doing, when in the course of human nature, of human history, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station, blah, blah, blah. Jefferson is using this technical rhetorical approach where he will say to the British reader, we really don't want to do this. We just don't have a choice. And to that degree, we're kind of forced to do this, even though it's kind of against our nature as colonists to do this thing called going to war and declaring our independence. So as you begin the writing of your paper, give some consideration to the historical precedent. You got to do your research. Good writers are good researchers. That is to say, good writers are good readers. Before you're ever a writer, you're a reader. And you read what? Both sides of the argument, not just what agrees for you, but also what disagrees for you. And in the process of presentation of validation, and now this is our final observation, we want to make sure in presenting our validation that we present research for both sides. We don't want to just present our citations for our side alone. This will make us appear as if we're a little too biased. We're a little too much editorializing. Now, finally, remember you are playing a game when you are writing Persuasion for the prof. Most of the time, I got to give this line with a caveat. Most of the time, the instructor doesn't have an axe to grind, politically speaking, one way or the other. In other words, you don't have to try to figure out what is the political position of the prof and then write to that so that you can get your paper. Most qualified instructors will look at your work of persuasion and they will play the game with you. They will ask a two-part question. One, what is the arguable thesis and is it a legitimate arguable thesis? Two, does the writer actually play fair? Does the writer present both sides of the position? Does the writer demonstrate a competency in these areas of conceding a point, consideration of the historical precedent? Okay? Do you have any questions for me now, specific to your work of persuasion? Okay, so